A new home, a new life. Lynn adjusted the strap of her suitcase, her heart pounding as she stepped through the doorway of the Duong family's suburban home in San Jose, California. The soft afternoon sunlight filtered through the bay window, dancing on the hardwood floors and casting a warm glow over the carefully arranged altar in the living room. A familiar nod to her Vietnamese roots, yet thrown into sharp contrast by the modern American kitchen just beyond. It was a space that straddled two worlds, much like her own heart. 28 years old, Lynn had only recently arrived in the United States after marrying Tom, a gentle, soft-spoken software engineer who'd grown up straddling the border of Vietnamese tradition and American individualism. Their wedding, a modest ceremony that combined Vietnamese rituals with Western vows, had been the start of not just a marriage, but a voyage into the unknown for Lynn. Now, reality settled over her like a weighted blanket. Lynn was no longer just a bride. She was a daughter-in-law, expected to fulfill her role under the keen, watchful eyes of her new family, led by Mrs. Phuong Duong. Mrs. Duong, Tom's mother, was a statuesque woman in her early 60s, her hair cropped neatly and her features set in an expression of perpetual scrutiny. Having fled Vietnam with her husband in the aftermath of war, she had built her life in America brick by brick, working arduous hours, refusing to relinquish old values even as the new world beckoned. Tom's father had passed away several years back. The house that once echoed with laughter now seemed to carry silence like a second language. From the moment Lynn entered, she became hyper-aware of the choreography of her every movement. Where to set her shoes, how low to bow in greeting, how much deference to express without appearing servile. Mrs. Duong acknowledged her arrival with a polite but cool nod, her eyes noting Lynn's suitcase, her modest clothing, the accent in her English. Tom, eager to ease the tension, carried Lynn's bag up the stairs, narrating family stories, making small jokes that fluttered and fell flat under his mother's stony silence. The house, though not large by American standards, was meticulously tidy. Photographs lined the mantel, black and white images of Saigon, faded Polaroids from family gatherings, Tom's graduation pictures in a blue gown, and scattered among them, a few subtle signs of loss, an urn, a folded flag, hints that this was a family marked by decades of struggle. At dinner, Lynn found herself seated across from Mrs. Duong, who took charge of the meal with military precision. The food, a blend of caramelized pork belly, stir-fried vegetables, and a casserole Tom had insisted on making, mirrored the hybrid of cultures that shaped this household. Conversation was sparse. Mrs. Duong inquired after Lynn's parents, her tone crisp, requesting details about Lynn's upbringing, schooling, and employment in Hanoi, evaluating her answers with narrowed eyes. After the meal, Lynn offered to help clear the table. She was met with an ambiguous, "It's fine, you are our guest, for now," from Mrs. Duong. The implication was clear. Soon she would be expected to know, without being told, her responsibilities as a daughter-in-law. Tom, sensing Lynn's unease, squeezed her hand under the table, his silent message offering comfort that felt both tender and inadequate. Later that night, as Lynn unpacked her belongings in the modest upstairs bedroom, she felt the enormity of the journey ahead. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of conversation between Tom and his mother, voices low and urgent, the topic unmissable. Her. She gazed out the window at the quiet suburban street, realizing that, although she was thousands of miles from Hanoi, the feelings of being scrutinized and measured were unsettlingly familiar. Lynn took solace in small rituals, folding her clothes with care, placing her wedding photo by the bedside, and whispering a silent prayer for strength. She understood this house didn't only test her adaptability to a new country, but her resilience, her capacity to earn love and place in a family shaped by both nostalgia and unspoken expectations. As the first night crept in, Lynn lay awake, heart taut with hope and anxiety. The walls around her echoed with memories that weren't her own, while the future whispered possibilities both daunting and sweet. The new home was more than a physical space. It was the threshold to a new life, one where courage, kindness, and patience would become her daily companions. The Club of Prejudices. The honeymoon glow faded quickly for Lin as the days in the Duong household slipped uneasily into patterns ruled by tradition, scrutiny, and unwritten expectations. Each morning, as golden sunlight seeped through the slats of her new bedroom's blinds, Lin woke with the sense that she was being watched, not only by Mrs. Duong, but by the lingering presence of an entire heritage, thick as incense smoke and just as difficult to dispel. Mrs. Phuong Duong was, in many ways, the matriarch of a tightly knit Vietnamese-American community in this corner of San Jose. Her kitchen functioned as an unofficial gathering place, the site of countless Sunday lunches and holiday feasts, where tradition was preserved with a precision that bordered on ceremony. In these circles, every family's reputation was entwined. News traveled quickly, comparisons were constant, and standards, spoken and unspoken, were fiercely maintained. From the moment Lin joined the household, she found herself subject to a relentless, if mostly silent, evaluation. Mrs. Duong's expectations, sharpened by decades of personal sacrifice and community observation, dictated even the smallest tasks. A misplaced ingredient in the pantry, a dish dried in the wrong order, or a teacup not facing east, each minor infraction was met with a pointed glance or a clipped correction. "Back home, my mother-in-law never had to ask twice," Mrs. Duong remarked one morning as Lin fumbled with the ancient rice cooker. The words hung in the air, echoed by the silent judgment in her eyes. Lin bowed her head, her cheeks flushed with shame. She knew that her efforts were rarely enough, and that every success or mistake was archived, ready to be relayed to aunts, uncles, and cousins in the next family phone call. It wasn't just Mrs. Duong's standards that Lin struggled to navigate. Once a week, the extended family assembled for dinner. The table crowded with steaming chicken, fragrant pho, crisp spring rolls, and the cacophony of rapid-fire Vietnamese. Conversation, though seemingly light, sparkled with subtle jabs. A niece comparing Lin's accent to Tom's fluent English, an uncle remarking on the difference between Hanoi upbringing and California progressiveness. Even Tom, caught between loyalty to Lin and deference to his mother, became hesitant, words trailing off when the air brimmed with tension. Over time, Lin recognized that the judgments ran deeper than household chores or language mishaps. When she dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, Mrs. Duong pursed her lips. When she tried to slip a little American twist into a family recipe, the older women exchanged glances, tiny, imperceptible to outsiders, but clear as day to Lin. The men, for their part, rarely intervened, reinforcing a sense that the rules of this club were enforced by women, observed by all, and broken at one's peril. More than once, Lin heard whispers linger just outside her door in the evening or caught fragments of commentary at gatherings. "City girls, not like how we raised them back home. She'll learn, eventually." Loneliness ballooned inside her, thickening with every half-smile and half-hearted gesture of inclusion. What stung the most were the stories that circulated in the family group chat. A well-meaning cousin recounting how another daughter-in-law made the perfect pickled vegetables, or how someone else got promoted but still never forgot to stop by for her mother's birthday. Each anecdote felt less like inspiration and more like a reminder that Lin, still new and unproven, was always being compared, always falling just shy. She tried harder, waking earlier to help with breakfast, memorizing recipes, practicing the right words to say in the right tone. But the measuring stick kept shifting, and the threshold for acceptance remained just out of reach. Every act of kindness from Mrs. Duong, a gentle suggestion, a smile over shared tea, could turn quickly, undermined by a sharp comment or a cautionary tale about girls these days. The rules of this club were rarely written down, but their effects seeped into every minute of Lynn's new life. By the end of each week, Lynn felt both exhausted and invisible, her best intentions often misinterpreted, her individuality pressed into the shape of someone else's ideal. Yet, somewhere deep within, a quiet determination was forming, a resolve not to be broken, not to become just another tale of a difficult daughter-in-law. She understood that she was being tested, not only for her skills or obedience, but for her worthiness to belong, to become a member, not just a guest, of this powerful, demanding club of family and tradition. What Lynn did not realize was how these trials, each small humiliation, every misunderstood effort, would feed the ember of resistance in her heart, setting the stage for the storm to come. For now, though, she endured, learning the secret language of glances, gestures, and silence, knowing that one day she would need to speak and to be heard. The great upheaval, business failure. Spring in San Jose arrived with cherry blossoms and a sense of restless hope in the Duong household. Mrs. Phuong Duong, ever ambitious yet wary of surrendering control, had long harbored a dream of reclaiming a little piece of her old Saigon. A restaurant serving home-style Vietnamese food, bustling with laughter and aromas that could transport diners halfway across the world. After months of persuasion, Tom had finally agreed to partner with her, investing much of their savings and energy into what would become Saigon Corner. In the early days, the project felt electric. Lynn threw herself into painting walls, assembling furniture, and jotting down cherished family recipes as Mrs. Duong dictated them with brisk authority. Tom designed the logo and managed the technical side, point-of-sale systems, social media, and menu design. Neighbors and extended relatives dropped by for previews, offering well-meaning advice or silent judgments. Lynn felt a flutter of belonging, even pride, as she watched the storefront take shape. But the excitement soon gave way to undertones of friction and unresolved tension. Mrs. Duong, used to being the sole decision-maker, overrode suggestions from Tom and Lynn at every turn. Whether it was the placement of tables, lighting choices, or what desserts to serve, her word was final. Lynn tried to tread softly, sometimes sacrificing her own ideas to avoid confrontation, but it didn't take long for her to notice Mrs. Duong's skepticism whenever she spoke up. From the start, the family's business approach lacked transparency. Financial records were handwritten and stacked in a cluttered corner. Suppliers were selected based on old friendships rather than competitive prices or quality, and Mrs. Duong insisted on stocking the kitchen herself, even as inventory lists grew chaotic and waste stacked up. Tom's gentle warnings about expense tracking and technology upgrades went largely ignored. Lynn, aware of her limited voice, focused on supporting Tom and filling in wherever she could. The customers came, drawn by the promise of authentic food and word of mouth within the Vietnamese community. The restaurant's opening week bustled with energy, but by the end of the first month, cracks began to show. Complaints about inconsistent flavors and long wait times reached Tom, who struggled to mediate between his mother's ironclad routines and the realities of the American market. Lynn watched helplessly as stress mounted. The kitchen staff bickered over recipes, operational costs ballooned, and Mrs. Duong's pride kept her from delegating or listening to advice. When the numbers failed to add up, Mrs. Duong grew restless, blaming inflation or unreliable workers. Tom spent late nights poring over receipts and cash flow spreadsheets, shoulders hunched in frustration. Lynn tried to lighten the mood, offering to organize invoices or suggest marketing ideas, a weekend faux special, a loyalty punch card, more English language content on their social media page. Each attempt was met with polite dismissal or open irritation. Then came the tipping point. A calamitous health inspection uncovered poorly labeled food storage and expired ingredients, a result of hasty supply runs and lack of oversight. The restaurant was forced to close temporarily, news spreading quickly in the tight-knit community. Financial losses piled up. Long-standing tensions boiled over into arguments between Tom and his mother, sometimes sharp, sometimes heartbreakingly resigned. Lynn felt squeezed, blamed when she spoke up, invisible when she kept quiet. In the weeks that followed, as it became clear the business might not recover, quiet blame began to fester. Mrs. Duong's frustration turned inward, then outward. In hushed phone calls to distant relatives and whispered conversations that stopped when Lynn entered the room, words like bad luck and unlucky charm floated around. She lamented, "Things were better before. Maybe some people just bring misfortune." At first, Lynn tried to dismiss these barbs as superstition, a relic of older beliefs. But when Mrs. Duong criticized her choice of dates for the soft opening, or suggested that Lynn's involvement changed the family's luck, Lynn's spirit began to crack. The community, so quick to celebrate successes, now echoed with rumors, subtle yet undeniably cruel. Invitations to family gatherings grew sparse. Lynn recognized the silent but unmistakable shift. She was being blamed for Saigon Corner's failure. Tom, caught between loyalty to his mother and love for Lynn, hesitated to intervene. "She doesn't mean it," he would whisper in the dark. "She's just hurt. Give her time." But the isolation gnawed at Lynn, each day in the house marked by cool silences, glances loaded with accusation, and a sense that she was being quietly erased from the family's circle. The restaurant's bankruptcy was the final blow. Calls from creditors became the household's daily soundtrack. Mrs. Duong fell into bouts of bitter nostalgia, recounting days in Saigon when family shops flourished and honor mattered more than luck. For Lynn, this failure was not only a financial collapse, it was the catalyst for a storm of blame and alienation, the beginning of her most difficult trial in a foreign land. Yet amidst that storm, a stubborn seed of resolve quietly took root. Lynn knew the truth of what had happened, the missteps, the overlooked invoices, the pride that refused course correction. She understood, even if no one else wanted to listen. In this moment of upheaval, something silent but fierce began to grow inside her. A promise to defend herself, and one day, to reveal the truth that everyone else chose to ignore. Unspoken wounds. The once faint ache of isolation became a dull, persistent throb in the weeks after the restaurant fell. Morning sunlight found Lynn sitting at the edge of her bed each day, her hands wrapped around a cup of bitter instant coffee, steam curling into the stillness, warmth barely reaching her chest. The house, which once quivered with the friction of clashing personalities and slivers of laughter, now settled into an uneasy quiet. Nothing was said, but everything was felt, palpable as humidity clinging invisibly to the skin. For Lynn, grief resided in silence. She'd never known homesickness could gnaw the way it did, a slow, inarticulate hunger for the chaos of Hanoi, for her mother's voice and her sister's easy banter over steaming bowls of breakfast pho. In America, even the smallest details pressed heavy. How her footsteps echoed on the polished floorboards, how the television's muted Vietnamese news reports seemed to underline her distance from everything that once defined her. The kitchen, once her favorite place in any home, became a minefield. Lynn performed chores with cautious, practiced precision, scrubbing counters spotless, stacking plates in silent towers, keeping tomato sauce from splattering on the pristine stovetop. Mrs. Duong moved about the space like a general inspecting a defeated battleground, offering clipped instructions or arching a brow, wordless reproach passing from her eyes to Lynn's shoulders. Now and then she'd sigh, a soft, resentful sound, more eloquent than a tirade. Meals together, already sparse in words, grew almost unbearable. Tom's attempts at small talk evaporated in the cold air between his mother and his wife. When he asked Lynn about her day at her part-time office job, Mrs. Duong's lips tightened, as if each syllable from Lin cost the family some unspoken currency. Lin responded quietly, her English careful, her Vietnamese even more cautious. There was a new code in the air, a set of rules for speech and silence that no one ever named, one built around shame, guilt, and expectation. Sometimes Lin caught herself hoping for a dramatic confrontation, or even open accusations. She imagined herself arguing back, defending her role, shouting that the restaurant's failure was not her fault. Yet neither Mrs. Duong nor the rest of the family gave Lin any such release. Theirs was a subtler mechanism. The weaponizing of coldness, the slow withdrawal of intimacy, the conversation that ceased when Lin entered a room. The pain was quieter but more relentless. It didn't permit catharsis, only slow corrosion. Tom was trapped, and Lin knew it. In private, his hands trembled when he touched hers. At night, he apologized in hushed tones. He was sorry for his mother, for his own passiveness, for the long hours at work that left Lin exposed and alone. He promised that things would improve, that once the dust settled, his mother might find forgiveness or clarity. But Lin suspected that Tom's hopes were as fragile as spun glass, his resolve dulled by decades of filial obedience. Outside the home, Lin found little comfort. The Vietnamese community in San Jose, so warm at first, had quietly closed rank. She noticed the changes, conversations falling away as she approached, invitations to family meals or church groups quietly rescinded. Even friendly neighbors seemed to view her with a new wariness, their gazes sliding away when she offered a hesitant greeting. She was no longer Lin, the pleasant, eager young wife, but the girl rumored to have brought bad luck to the respected Duong family. In whispered exchanges dropped from one phone call to the next, her presence was recast as an omen, her actions scrutinized through the lens of suspicion and superstition. The wounds accumulated in layers. They were not always visible. There were no raised voices or slammed doors, no bruises or harsh words echoing down the halls. Instead, Lin carried the pain in the way she stiffened as she passed Mrs. Duong in the corridor, in the way she found herself locked in the bathroom, pressing her face to a towel to stifle tears she refused to let Tom hear. Loneliness made her body feel heavy, her mind ring with self-doubt. Was she too different? Too stubborn? Too American or not American enough? Some nights, Lin dreamed of escape. She imagined packing her belongings and setting out for a one-bedroom apartment in the city where no one knew her name, starting fresh among strangers. But each day, the same sense of responsibility and guilt pulled her back. She thought about her parents in Vietnam, how hard they worked to give Lin and her sister chances they'd never had. They'd trusted her to thrive in America, to build a family, to make the sacrifices they'd made worth something. That weight pressed harder than any accusation from Mrs. Duong. To leave now, Lin worried, would mean confirming every stereotype and suspicion, that immigrant daughters-in-law were flighty, unreliable, weak. The ache of disconnection clawed at Lin even when she tried to reach outward. She called home less often, afraid that the worry in her voice would travel across the ocean and burden people already struggling. When her younger sister asked why she sounded tired, Lin blamed long workdays and jet lag. She learned to offer half-truths and cheerful lies, clipping her stories to keep from unraveling. Occasionally, small kindnesses lit the gloom. A coworker, spotting Lin's puffy eyes, left a floral tea on her desk with a kind note written in careful block letters. "Here if you ever want to talk." A neighbor knocked one Sunday morning with a carton of fresh strawberries, chit-chatting about traffic and spring weather, never once mentioning the restaurant or Mrs. Duong. Those moments reminded Lin that compassion was neither bound by language nor always announced. It sometimes fluttered, shy and brief, but it was real. Yet even with glimmers of relief, the pattern remained. Lynn existed at the edges of comfort and suspicion, tending invisible wounds day after day. The world narrowed to tiny gestures: a meal left covered for Tom, a plant carefully watered on the windowsill, an old wedding photograph dusted every weekend. She found solace in ritual, building a fragile sense of self one quiet repetition at a time. In truth, Lynn barely recognized the woman she was becoming. She was not the bright-eyed newlywed, nor the confident translator her employer praised. She had shrunk herself to fit the shape of survival, suppressing opinions, and even the cadence of her laughter. Some days, her reflection felt unfamiliar. A woman weighed down by other people's stories, fighting to remember her own. Still, deep beneath the loneliness and exhaustion, a tiny ember burned. The memory that she'd built a life before this family, that she'd outlasted other storms, that she was not made solely from the judgments of others. Lynn did not yet know how or when she might speak up, or what the cost would be, but she sensed a change stirring inside her, the first flicker of resistance. Wounds, unspoken or not, marked her. But they also hinted, painfully, quietly, at the possibility of healing, and at the beginnings of a will to fight not just for acceptance, but for the truth. The first clue. The air in the Duong house had changed, not in temperature, but in texture. Every word, every glance lingered like smoke, hard to dispel. At first, Lynn thought she might grow used to it, that her skin would toughen to the burn of silent resentment. But instead, a nervous vigilance took root. Soon, she stopped moving through the house so much as slipping through it, wary, alert, attuned to every unspoken rule and unkind half-smile. It was in this state of near invisibility that she stumbled on her first clue. It began innocuously enough, a rainy Saturday, the sort that made the world outside look washed out and unfamiliar through rain-streaked windows. Mrs. Duong had stepped out to visit a distant cousin, leaving the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the tap-tap of Lynn's fingers on her mug. Tom, hunched over his laptop in the spare room, was trying his best to distract himself with job applications and bills, uneasy with so much uncertainty. Lynn wandered into the dining room, her gaze snagging on the clutter of papers, flyers, and unopened mail that had sprouted along the far edge of the buffet table since the restaurant closed. She had seen the pile before, but never dared to touch it. Mrs. Duong jealously guarded her papers, insisting she alone could sort the important documents from the junk. But today, with the house silent and heavy, Lynn's curiosity, and a sharp need for answers, overrode her caution. The first few envelopes were banal: utility bills, supermarket coupons, statements from the cable company. Then a file folder, heavy and bulging, caught her attention. She tried to convince herself she was only tidying up, but her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were dozens of receipts, some crumpled, some neatly folded, all dated within the past year. Lynn recognized the names of suppliers, Asian grocery stores, even contractors who had delivered kitchen equipment to Saigon Corner. But interspersed among them were less familiar names and receipts for far larger sums. Thousands of dollars wired to a business in another city, several cash withdrawals close to the restaurant's doomed grand reopening. There were also emails, printed out and highlighted in yellow, cryptic exchanges in Vietnamese about liabilities, side investments, and requests for quick loans off the books. The edges of Lynn's vision tightened. Carefully, she began sorting through the stack, separating out anything that felt unusual. Photocopies of checks, annotated menus, post-it notes with phone numbers, and reminders written in Mrs. Duong's sharp, angular script. There were lists of potential sponsors and scrawled notes about change suppliers, next to columns of numbers that failed to add up. The word urgent appeared again and again. One receipt, stamped on pink paper, made Lynn pause. It was marked consulting fee, $2,500, paid to a company Lynn didn't recognize but, after a quick internet search on her phone, discovered was a struggling import-export firm with the owner's name eerily similar to a frequent guest at family parties. Layer after layer, the narrative emerging was one of risk, desperation, and hasty decisions. And yet, in every conversation since the restaurant's closing, Mrs. Duong had blamed everything but her own choices: the economy, unreliable staff, even Lynn's supposed bad luck. Lynn's mind raced. She wasn't sure what she was looking for at first, but as documents began to pile up on the table, a picture started to form. The business hadn't simply failed for generic reasons. It had been doomed by mismanagement, side deals, and secretive maneuvering, all hidden or ignored as rumors swirled, pointing fingers everywhere but at the truth. A sense of betrayal stung her, sharp and sudden. If so much of the story about Saigon Corner had been concealed or rewritten, what else had Lynn been told that wasn't the whole truth? She snapped photos of the most damning papers, emailing them to a private, newly created account. Just in case. It felt dangerous, but necessary. She also started keeping a diary in her phone, recording dates and details, her own memories alongside evidence. April 14th. Received call from Mrs. May asking about investment returns. May 2nd. Large withdrawal from family account. May 9th. Email exchange supplier, kickback. Each entry, she told herself, was protection. Each record was a life preserver as she paddled in deeper, uncharted waters. When she finished compiling the documents, Lynn stared at the stack, her heart racing with dread and a new, strange energy. Her initial impulse was to confront Mrs. Duong, or at least tell Tom what she'd found. But experience, sharpened by months of cold shouldering and accusations, kept her cautious. Who would take her word against his mother's? Wouldn't it just seem like she was lashing out, desperate for an alibi? Instead, Lynn hid the folder back in its original haphazard nest and methodically returned the table to the way she'd found it. She forced herself to breathe deeply, heart hammering in her chest as she wiped her fingerprints from the glossy paper. Then she waited, outwardly calm as ever, but now, with a secret burning like a brand beneath her ribs. That evening, as rain drummed softly on the roof, Lynn's demeanor was unchanged, quiet, careful, deferential. Mrs. Duong returned from her outing, bags filled with groceries, and swept past Lynn with a mumbled greeting. Lynn watched her mother-in-law with new eyes, the way she double-checked the locks, the nervous flutter of hands as she stuffed receipts into her purse, the quick scan of the buffet table as she passed the dining room. Was Mrs. Duong aware that her secrets might soon be unearthed? Or had she grown so comfortable wearing the mask of the infallible matriarch that she believed she could never be caught? If Tom noticed anything different, he said nothing. Lynn watched her husband at dinner, the deep lines of stress cutting into his face, the haunted look he wore when he thought no one saw. She ached for him, not just as her partner, but as someone caught, like her, in the tightening net of family loyalty and silence. For now, Lynn chose to keep her discovery between herself and her phone, unsure how best to reveal what she knew without making things worse for them both. Over the days that followed, her resolve hardened. Lynn revisited the buffet table whenever she could, searching for more clues. A banker's business card tucked into an old calendar, post-it notes about emergency meetings, even voice memos on the family's shared tablet that mentioned loans and silent partners. Each find made her feel more like a detective in her own life. Each new piece strengthened the case, not just for herself, but for the truth. Something that now seemed urgent not to prove her innocence, but to reclaim her dignity. The more Lynn uncovered, the clearer her path became. She would build her case carefully, methodically, refusing to let rage make her reckless. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope pierced the haze. She had agency, however small. She was no longer simply enduring. She was pushing back, step by step, arming herself for a confrontation she knew was coming. Long after midnight, Lynn sat beneath the dim lamp of her bedroom, reviewing her secret digital archive. Doubt and fear gnawed at her, but something fiercer thrummed beneath. The conviction that if she did not speak up for herself, and perhaps for others who had been scapegoated by family pride, then Mrs. Duong's version of the story would become their only legacy. Lynn was determined, for the first time in a long while, not to let that happen. She closed her phone and lay back, listening to the slowed rhythm of the rain. The wounded girl she'd been weeks ago seemed distant, hollowed out by grief and blame. In her place was someone alert and battle-ready, her pain finally giving way to dogged clarity. Lynn understood now that exposing the truth would demand courage, and that the cost, whatever it turned out to be, would be worth paying to reclaim herself. The tempest rises. Rumors, like wildfire, rarely needed a spark to spread, only the hint of something combustible. In the weeks following Lynn's quiet discovery, the winds of gossip gathered, fierce and capricious. Whispers that had started behind closed doors in the Duong household now spilled out into the Vietnamese community of San Jose, growing louder with every retelling, every sidelong glance, every click of a social media post that never quite said her name, but always meant her. On Facebook, stories circulated in the community's private groups. Did you hear about Mrs. Duong's restaurant? Word is, the unlucky bride brought misfortune from overseas. So sad for Tom's family. He used to be so promising. Lynn's phone vibrated with group chat notifications that she couldn't bear to open. Sometimes it was a distant relative from Texas with a one-line message. Take care of yourself, things seem tense. But more often, it was silence, the absence of contact from friends who once called her sister. At the local market, Lynn felt gazes graze over her, then flick away quickly. Aunties she barely knew stopped their carts just to comment, loud enough for her to hear, about daughters-in-law who failed to absorb the proper values. Even ladies from church, who had previously enveloped her in welcoming hugs, grew reserved, their greetings clipped or replaced by the weather's gray platitudes. Inside the Duong home, the pressure was crushing. The routines grew colder. Lynn moved through her days cloaked in unease, bracing herself before every encounter, as if for a coming storm. Mrs. Duong avoided direct conversation. Instead, her verdicts were delivered through sighs, pointed looks, and strategically loud phone calls. Family should bring luck, not hardship. Or, if only things were as they were, we wouldn't be in such trouble. Lynn felt herself shrinking, a shadow within the walls of a house that suddenly felt too large and yet suffocating. Tom oscillated between helpless anger and weary detachment. Some nights, he tried to talk, his voice rough with regret. I'm sorry, Lynn. I should do more, but this is all so much. Other times, he sat by the window in silence, shoulders hunched, as though the weight of the entire family's disappointment pressed on his chest. He fielded calls from creditors and cousins, his replies short, sometimes defensive, his eyes growing more haunted with each conversation. The tension reached all corners of Lynn's life. At her part-time job, a small translation office, she noticed colleagues glancing up from their screens as she passed, their questions polite but edged with curiosity. "How's everything at home?" they would ask, their smiles lingering a beat too long, as if waiting for a confession. She responded with practiced cheerfulness, masking the turmoil inside. Only her friend and coworker, Melanie, seemed to notice the cracks. Melanie was a Californian through and through, direct, bright-eyed, and unafraid to ask hard questions. One afternoon, as they sat in the break room over reheated pho, Melanie nudged gently. "You seem sad lately, Lynn. You know you can talk to me, right?" Lynn hesitated, unwilling to unravel the web of shame and misunderstanding that now bound her days, but Melanie persisted. "Don't let other people's stories become your script," she said softly, sliding a cup of chamomile tea across the table. Lynn felt tears prick behind her eyes, not for her pain, but at the startling sensation of being seen. That night, she let herself cry quietly on her pillow, releasing a little of the bitterness that knotted her chest. The conversation with Melanie was a lifeline, reminding her that some storms were not meant to be endured alone. But the storm at home reached new intensity after an especially vicious wave of gossip hit the family group chat, complete with screenshots of a thread blaming Lynn for Saigon Corner's failure. The accusation was subtle, wrapped in questions about her choice of dates and modern attitudes. It was enough to set Mrs. Duong off into a private fit of sobbing and murmured prayers, followed by a period of frosty isolation that bled into every meal, every shared space. At dinner the next evening, the house was heavy with the smell of simmered fish and silent accusation. Tom poked at his rice, while Lynn crumbled bread between trembling fingers, and Mrs. Duong sniffed loudly, refusing to meet their eyes. The silence was broken only by the ring of the house phone, another family member, wanting the latest update on the problem. Lynn considered, for the first time, packing her things and leaving. She imagined the relief of silence, the escape from judgment, the chance to draw breath in a space that belonged to her alone. But then she thought of her family in Hanoi, their sacrifice, their hope, and the image of her sister's last message. "Be strong, Chiyoy. Don't let anyone make you small." Instead of surrendering, Lynn chose to fight, quietly at first, gathering every scrap of dignity she could find. She reached out to the few friends who still called back, accepting Melanie's invitation for coffee, letting herself share, haltingly at first, her story and shame. She began writing again at night, not only updating her private archive of evidence, but journaling her feelings, every slight, every moment of resilience, naming the wounds that before had only festered in shadow. Outside, rumors still swirled, and the chill in her home did not abate. But piece by piece, Lynn started to reclaim small things. A morning walk in the neighborhood, a new houseplant rescued from the bargain rack, a fresh recipe tried just for herself. She allowed herself small pleasures, tiny rebellions against the narrative trying to define her. One Thursday morning, as Lynn stepped outside for a breath of spring air, she paused at the edge of the driveway. The street was calm, watched only by a neighbor's wary cat perched on a window ledge. Lynn looked up at the bright, cloudless sky, a sky that felt, for the briefest moment, empty of judgment. She inhaled deeply. The tempest was still all around her, but something steady was beginning to grow within. She realized then, storms, no matter how fierce, could not last forever, and some roots only sink deeper when battered by wind and rain. Family meeting. Night. The idea came to Lynn late on a sleepless night, her mind spinning cycles of dread and unspoken arguments. Something had to change. She could no longer tolerate the unrelenting whispers or the way tension collected in every corner of the house until it pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She needed to reclaim her voice. The following day, heart pounding, she approached Tom as he sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand and shoulders slumped. Sunlight dappled the linoleum, but the kitchen felt dim, the air thick with unasked questions. Lynn spoke quietly, but with conviction. Tom looked up, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He hesitated, but after a long moment, he nodded. "If you're sure," he murmured, "I'll help you arrange it." "It's time," Lin words spread quickly, partly because Mrs. Duong, always eager to shape the family narrative, called each relative herself, masking her misgivings in brisk formality. That Saturday, cars lined the block outside the Duong home. Aunties in pressed slacks and uncles in crisp dress shirts crowded into the living and dining rooms, chatter and speculation bubbling beneath the surface. Even the younger generation, Tom's cousins and their spouses, arrived, drawn by equal parts familial obligation and curiosity. Tom rearranged chairs, while Lin laid out tea and small pastries, her hands trembling but her mind sharp. Mrs. Duong watched it all from a corner, her face unreadable behind a veneer of etiquette. If she felt vulnerable, she hid it well, lips drawn in a thin, determined line. More than once, Lin caught her mother-in-law's eye, a warning, a plea, or maybe just surprise at Lin's resolve. When everyone had gathered, an uneasy hush fell. Lin stood by the family altar, wedding picture beside her, and took a steadying breath. She glanced at Tom, who offered a supportive nod, and then at the array of faces before her. Some, she realized, were not entirely unfriendly. Others gleamed with skepticism, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. She began quietly, her voice steady with purpose. A ripple went through the room. Mrs. Duong's brows drew together, but she did not interrupt. Lin reached for her folder, which she'd placed on the table before her. She pulled out a few sheets, holding them up. There were decisions made, risks taken, side deals and money lent under the table to old acquaintances, supplies mismanaged, bills overlooked. When mistakes happened, the blame landed quietly on me. Because I was new, because I was quiet, because it was easier that way. The room was completely silent now, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Some relatives looked at the floor. Others stared at the documents with open concern. A distant aunt cleared her throat, but Lin pressed on. "These receipts," she gestured to a small pile, "show cash withdrawals right before our health inspection and payments to businesses connected to family friends. There are emails requesting urgent loans, which never showed up in our accounting books. All of this is what led to Saigon Corner's problems. Not superstition, not anyone's aura, and certainly not the new daughter-in-law you barely know." She put the papers down and let her gaze move around the room. "What hurt me wasn't just the whispers about bad luck. It was the silence, the way you stopped calling, the way I became a ghost at family gatherings. None of you ever asked for my side of the story. Not once. The effect was immediate and uneven. Some relatives looked chastened. A few exchanged sheepish glances. Several of the older women muttered, but others sat straighter, curiosity deepening into concern. Tom finally stood and broke the tension. He looked at his mother, who seemed frozen, her hands knotted over her lap. For several long moments, the room was tense enough to snap. Then one of Tom's uncles spoke up, a man Lin barely knew, but whose words cut clearly through the atmosphere. The older cousins voiced quiet support, some for Lin, some in defense of traditional ways. Yet a conversation had begun, honest and raw in a way Lin had never witnessed before. Slowly, other relatives chimed in, a cousin apologizing for her coldness, an aunt admitting that gossip, once begun, only grows, a nephew asking questions about the receipts. Mrs. Duong's composure finally cracked. She stood, her voice trembling. She turned to Lin, her expression a complex swirl of pride, regret, and something close to fear. Tears pricked Lin's eyes. She did not speak, But Tom squeezed her hand, and for the first time in months, she felt a tiny crack open in the house's silence, a possibility that healing could begin. The meeting continued into the night, old wounds named and sometimes gently prodded. No miracle occurred, but for Lynn, that wasn't the point. At last, she'd spoken. At last, the story was no longer just hers, alone to bear. Facing the truth, the echoes of the family meeting lingered for days, ricocheting through the Duong household in tense silence. Meals were quieter, conversations clipped, but beneath the awkward surface, something unfamiliar took root, an uneasy honesty crackling through each interaction. For the first time since Lynn's arrival from Hanoi, the air felt less suffocating, as if the house was tentatively drawing its first deep breath after a season of storms. But no family could heal overnight, especially after months of resentment and unspoken blame. The next challenge, Lynn knew, was not simply reliving old wounds, but openly confronting the truths that had festered in silence. It began the morning after the meeting, with sunlight streaming over the quiet kitchen. Lynn woke early, finding Mrs. Duong already at the table, nursing a mug of coffee. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The old script, indifference shrouded in duty, hung between them. But Mrs. Duong exhaled softly, not a sigh of disappointment, but something closer to surrender. "Sit," Mrs. Duong said, gesturing to the opposite chair. Her voice, stripped of its usual armor, revealed fatigue and perhaps a plea. Lynn hesitated, then obeyed, her hands wrapped nervously around her own coffee mug. For a moment, the room filled with the clink of spoons and the faint rhythms of traffic outside. Mrs. Duong broke the silence. "I thought if I pretended hard enough, everything could go back to the way it was when your father-in-law was alive, when it seemed like hard work and pride could fix anything." She rubbed the bridge of her nose, voice cracking. "But I see now, I was not just blind. I was hurting all of you." Lynn kept her gaze steady, searching her mother-in-law's face for pretense or accusation, but saw only a woman laid bare by loss and regret. "I should have listened more. I blamed you to hide from my own mistakes," Mrs. Duong continued, her accent thickening with emotion. "My fear. My shame. I am sorry, Lynn." It was nothing close to easy nor cinematic in its resolution. Lynn wanted to offer comfort or absolution, but found herself trembling. Old grievances knotted in her stomach. She took a slow breath. "I never wanted to ruin anything," she said quietly. "I came here to join your family, not to take something away. I made mistakes too. I was afraid if I spoke, it wouldn't matter." "What you said last night," Mrs. Duong interrupted, then faltered. "That took strength I never knew I had. To admit your pain, to show your evidence, your truth." She reached a tentative hand across the table, her grip hesitant. "You did what I could not." For a while, they sat in stillness, the beginnings of understanding flickering between them. Lynn realized this was what true reconciliation required. Not grand gestures, but tiny offerings of honesty again and again. Later, when Tom joined them, he was surprised by the fragile peace. Unable to hide his hope, he pressed for another conversation, this time a full gathering, but smaller, more private. Just Tom, Lynn, and his mother. Over a simple lunch, Lynn and Mrs. Duong spoke not only of the business, but of their lives before San Jose. Lynn described her childhood in Hanoi, the different textures of love, pride, and sacrifice. Mrs. Duong described her early years in America, scraping together rent, the razor edge of immigrant loneliness, the pain of losing her husband and raising a son between two worlds. For Tom, it was both painful and redemptive, a collision of old and new, of misunderstandings reframed through empathy. He admitted his failings, to challenge either woman, to set boundaries, to speak up sooner when blame began to spread. I let the silence grow because it was easier than facing conflict. But all it did was make everyone lonelier, he said, voice choked. I want to do better. I want us to be honest, even if it's hard. This new atmosphere did not erase the community's rumors overnight. There were still icy glances at the market, still whispers at church about the unlucky bride. Some relatives, stung by the family meeting, kept their distance or expressed only lukewarm support. But others, the uncle who'd spoken up that night, a cousin who remembered Lynn's gentle kindness, came forward, awkward but sincere. One evening, as Lynn prepared dinner, that same uncle knocked at the door, holding a bag of oranges from his garden. For luck, he said with a sheepish grin, and for fresh starts. Bit by bit, Lynn began to reclaim small joys. She ventured out for coffee with Melanie, who encouraged her to see the strength and courage she'd shown. Tom, now more attentive and vulnerable, accompanied Lynn for walks, listening not only to her words but to her silences, the spaces where grief took on new meaning. Mrs. Duong, humbled and changed, tentatively invited Lynn to help her with family recipes, this time gently, with questions, not commands. But the most crucial confrontation came one Sunday afternoon when the Duong women visited a local Buddhist temple. There, in the hush of incense and sunlight, Mrs. Duong performed a ritual she'd long neglected, a prayer not for fortune, but for self-forgiveness and guidance. Lynn, sitting beside her, felt the shared ache of old wounds. She realized forgiveness was not a single act, but a daily choice. She would never be the ideal daughter-in-law of someone else's memories, nor would she abandon the values her parents had given her. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt the stirrings of belonging, not as an accident of marriage, but as the result of hard-won truth. Rebuilding would take time. There were memories that would still draw shadows across conversations. Some relatives might never fully accept Lynn, their values shaped by decades of tradition and pride. Some losses, financial and emotional, would never be replaced. Yet Lynn knew she had taken back her dignity. She had spoken, she had been heard, and she had forced a reckoning that gave the family its first honest chance to heal. Mrs. Duong, for all her old wounds and cautiousness, recognized that her own strength now lay in humility and connection, not authority and control. In the quiet aftermath, Lynn found peace in small rituals. A recipe taught hand in hand, a short walk around the blossoming cherry trees, laughter with Tom and his mother over a meal not judged, but celebrated. Facing the truth had not only changed the narrative, it had changed the storyteller as well. Rebuilding relationships. The slow work of healing looked nothing like Lynn had once imagined. There was no dramatic apology, no single moment of vindication. Instead, rebuilding unfolded in the gentle rhythm of daily life, a mosaic of tentative gestures, soft words, and difficult honesty. After the cathartic family meeting and the quiet morning conversations with Mrs. Duong, the Duong household felt as if a storm had passed but left behind scattered debris. Progress was uneven. Some days felt brighter, threaded with a cautious warmth, while others still bore shadows of old discomfort. But Lynn noticed the difference with each sunrise. She found herself less on guard, her breath no longer shallow with anticipation for the next slight or cold remark. One morning, Lynn gathered her courage and began replanting the half-withered herbs in the kitchen windowsill, a task she'd avoided for months, afraid that Mrs. Duong might critique her efforts or see it as an intrusion. But when the older woman passed by, she simply asked, "Need some basil seeds? I saved a few from last year." It was a small gesture, but Lin met her halfway, nodding and making space for them both at the windowsill. Gardening became their quiet language, a way to rebuild trust without searching for perfect words. With the restaurant gone, Tom took a steady job at a local tech firm. Less prestigious and more demanding than his previous work, but it brought steady pay and restored some family. Security Lin resumed her part-time job at the translation office, feeling, for the first time, a sense of community among her colleagues. At lunch, Melanie teased her gently about her famous home-cooked meals, and soon Lin was hosting a small potluck at their apartment, introducing her new friends to the subtle flavors of northern Vietnamese cuisine. Within the extended family, changes surfaced unevenly. Some relatives remained distant, loyal to old prejudices, or reluctant to revisit lingering embarrassments. But a handful, like Tom's forgiving uncle and a cousin who'd quietly supported Lin through WhatsApp messages, became genuine allies. When Lin's birthday arrived, the family gathered for a modest dinner. There were still awkward pauses, but the laughter that rose around the table was real, not forced. Rebuilding trust with Mrs. Duong proved the most delicate task of all. The older woman was a creature of habit, and for years she had worn control and silence as armor. There were days she still lapsed into defensiveness or nostalgia, sometimes sighing over how much simpler life had seemed back in Saigon. But Lin noticed her mother-in-law making real efforts to meet her halfway, asking for advice about shopping or hinting that Lin's way of making caramel sauce was, perhaps, better after all. Together they began to revisit family rituals, not out of obligation, but as a shared creation. They set the altar with flowers on ancestral remembrance days, each woman taking turns lighting incense and quietly sharing a thought or prayer. Lin listened to Mrs. Duong recount stories about her late husband, her regrets and her pride, her heartbreak and her hope, and for the first time felt those memories could become a bridge rather than a wall. Tom, for his part, had changed too. The rift between his mother and his wife had pulled him in opposite directions for too long. Now, he found strength in the vulnerability Lin had shown and became more open about his own struggle to balance tradition and independence. Sometimes, late at night, Tom and Lin would go for long walks around the quiet neighborhood, holding hands, reflecting on what they'd learned, not just about the family, but about themselves. "There's no instruction manual for this," Tom admitted one evening, glancing at the gold-threaded clouds above them. "Sometimes, I feel like we're making it up as we go." "That's all anyone does," Lin said, squeezing his hand. "The only difference is whether we choose to be honest along the way." But setbacks remained. Word of the scandal at Saigon Corner occasionally resurfaced in the community, passed along in church kitchens or over market stalls. Lin overheard aunties questioning her choices or muttering about how much times have changed. She learned that not every wound would close, and not every person was ready to move on. Some conversations left her raw, but she grew more adept at setting boundaries and refusing to internalize other people's judgments. Letting go of her own anger took longer. Some days, Lin was startled by how much hurt she still carried. The memory of being blamed, the weight of isolation, the ache of homesickness and longing for Hanoi. But she made a deliberate decision to forgive, not for their sake, but for her own peace. She even found herself missing Vietnam less, instead, building a small altar for her memories. Postcards, a recipe from her mother, a favorite silk scarf. Rebuilding, Lin realized, started with small intentions. She began leaving handwritten notes of gratitude for Mrs. Duong, thanking her for sharing recipes or helping with a difficult phone call. She started new traditions with Tom, like Sunday morning walks or trying a new dish together each month, blending flavors from East and West. On rainy afternoons, she wrote letters to her sister back home, describing not just her struggles, but also the funny, ordinary victories. Growing green onions straight from old bulbs, fixing a leaky faucet, laughing at American sitcoms with Tom. With time, Lynn's roots in America felt deeper. Not because she'd erased her past, but because she'd chosen, day by day, to build something real in the present. Both she and Mrs. Duong were changed by their reckoning. Lynn became more assertive, unafraid to voice her boundaries and dreams. Mrs. Duong, while still proud, learned the quiet strength of apologizing and letting go. One evening, as the three of them gathered in the living room for tea, Mrs. Duong surprised Lynn by raising her cup in a gentle toast. Lynn smiled, understanding that this was as close to an open embrace as Mrs. Duong might ever offer. But it was enough. It was everything. As the months passed, the Duong family's scars faded. Not forgotten, but honored as reminders of how far they'd come. In Lynn's heart, gratitude finally exceeded resentment. She had spoken her truth, fought for her place, and in doing so, had given her new family the chance to begin anew. Rebuilding was messy and imperfect, and always would be. But in that imperfection, Lynn found real belonging. The kind earned not by blood or tradition, but by courage, forgiveness, and love. The sweetest revenge. It began as a whisper of an idea, light and almost mocking, a phrase Lynn's mother used to say in Hanoi. The sweetest revenge is living well. For months, Lynn's world had been shaped by hardship, suspicion, and the tug-of-war between tradition and her own sense of self. She had endured humiliation not by confrontation, but by endurance, rebuilding not only her relationships, but her own inner foundation. Yet now, with the harshest storms behind her, Lynn started to imagine what it would look like not simply to recover, but to truly thrive. Spring lingered in their San Jose neighborhood, bringing bursts of color to the small yards and parks. Lynn spent her mornings working from home, translating documents for clients all over California, and her afternoons tending the newly blossoming herb garden by the kitchen. Mrs. Duong would often stop by as she chopped chives or pinched basil, sometimes giving advice, other times merely watching, her gaze softer than before. Though the gossip at church and among distant relatives never died away entirely, the sharper edges dulled. Aunties who once whispered about Lynn's inauspicious aura now paused to ask for her steamed bun recipe. News of Saigon Corner's failure faded beneath the rhythm of birthdays, family gatherings, and the small, persistent victories of daily life. What Lynn had not expected was how much her own mindset began to change. Each evening, Tom and Lynn would share stories from their days, her quirky clients, his challenging projects at work. As the kitchen warmed with the scents of simmered soup or Tom's attempts at fusion food. Silences still happened, but now they felt peaceful rather than tense. It was Tom who first suggested that Lynn share her unique perspective more widely. You know, you're a natural at finding connections between languages, between people, he said one evening, sprawled on the living room floor with a pile of Lynn's translation work. What if you offered a workshop at the community center? Something for new immigrants. Help them find their feet here. Show them it's possible. At first, Lynn hesitated. She worried about scrutiny, about exposing herself again to public judgment. But a deeper part of her, the woman who had weathered storms, who had claimed her own worth, was intrigued. Within weeks, Lynn had partnered with the local community center and drafted flyers for a bilingual workshop, Finding Your Voice in a New World, Building Confidence, Language, and Home. There were practical sessions, resume clinics, interview prep, translation help, but also tea circles, recipe swaps, and discussions about cultural tradition. The first Saturday, only 6 people showed up, all nervous and shy. By the third week, the room was packed. Lynn watched herself transform as she coached young mothers on their first job interviews, shared homemade banh quan with recent arrivals from Saigon, and listened as teenagers discussed the challenge of pleasing strict parents while longing to fit in at school. Her own story emerged naturally: struggles, misunderstandings, and the power of stating one's truth. Lynn found herself not just a survivor, but a source of hope. To her surprise, Mrs. Duong began attending the workshops as well, not as a teacher, but as a learner. She would sit quietly during the discussions, occasionally chiming in with childhood stories from the old days, then volunteering to lead sessions on herbal medicine or traditional desserts. Her presence sent quiet ripples through the community. The mother-in-law who had once guarded boundaries now helped break them, not with grand speeches, but with small, steady acts. One afternoon, after a particularly lively class, Lynn found Mrs. Duong waiting as the last participants trickled out. The air was fragrant with lemongrass and laughter. "I didn't know you could do all this," Mrs. Duong said quietly, not meeting Lynn's eyes. "I used to think the only way to honor our family was to keep everything old, to judge things I didn't understand. Now, I see you make a different kind of family, even out of strangers." Lynn smiled, her heart swelling with emotion both tender and triumphant. "I just tried to do what you used to do, bring people together. Only now we do it with new recipes and new ways the neighbors noticed. So did the gossiping aunties." But the talk had changed. Instead of whispers about misfortune, people remarked on Lynn's kindness, her American way of blending compassion with practicality, her ability to honor Vietnamese roots while opening doors to the wider world. Tom's pride was evident, even as he kept his jokes light. "They said marrying you would change my luck." They were right. I just didn't know luck meant having the bravest wife in San Jose. When Lynn laughed, Tom's eyes shone with both relief and wonder. After so much hardship, their marriage felt strangely new, a partnership tested and at last freely chosen. Lynn didn't seek revenge against those who had hurt her, not with words and not with coldness. But occasionally, when the family gathered for dinner, she noticed a transformation in the room. Mrs. Duong and the aunties asked for her advice on community events. Younger cousins came to her for coaching on college essays. Even old friends from her first painful months in America stopped by her kitchen. "I never thought I'd feel at home here," Lynn confessed to her sister during a video call on a rainy evening. "But something changed, Chia. I think. I stopped waiting for acceptance and started building it, one conversation at a time." Her sister smiled knowingly. "The sweetest revenge is to live so well that everyone wants your recipe for happiness." With time, Lynn became known not just as Tom's wife or Mrs. Duong's daughter-in-law, but as a connector, someone who knew how to hold on to what mattered from her old world while helping others thrive in the new one. She was invited to speak at high schools and cultural festivals. Sometimes, she was even featured in local papers, her story a symbol of resilience and East meets West success. But for Lynn, the sweetest victory was the simplest: harvesting mint with Mrs. Duong in their sunny kitchen, teaching Tom's nephew to say thank you in Vietnamese, seeing old rivalries fade into laughter over shared meals. She no longer shrank herself to fit inherited expectations. Instead, Lynn chose which traditions to keep and which ones to gently let go. As spring ripened into long, golden days, Lynn stood by the open window, a gentle breeze swirling around her. The wounds of the past had left their marks, but they no longer defined her. Now her story was one of courage, forgiveness, and a different kind of justice, the justice of a life well lived, filled with roots that ran deep and branches open to possibility. That, Lynn realized, was the sweetest revenge of all.